All right, so we're going to talk about the 1940s and the 1950s. So this is the beginning of the Cold War era. So this is right after World War II. The United States was doing very well financially after World War II because of all the war production. We became the wealthiest nation on the planet because we accounted for about 40% of the wealth, and we had higher education and improved technology thanks to World War II. So after World War II, you have the birth of the suburbs, and so by 1960, 25% of Americans lived in the suburbs and what they call these cookie cutter houses. So the same kind of houses we see in subdivisions today that all look basically the same. They have really similar floor plan, and they figured out a way to use the assembly line production to mass produce houses. So they mass produced homes. And this led to people leaving the city and moving into the suburbs, and the baby boom, which is the largest generation. So probably your grandparents' generation are boomers. So anybody born between 1945 and 1960 are considered baby boomers. About 50 million babies were born in this time period. So they are the largest generation in American history. So after World War II, we established the UN, and the UN is housed in New York City, and so this is the UN in New York City. And they set up 5 countries that had permanent veto powers: China, Soviet Union, which is now Russia, Britain, France, and us. And so a lot of the issues that we have dealing with things like Russia and Ukraine today stem from the fact that Russia has veto power. So UN can tell Russia to stop attacking the Ukraine, but they can't actually make them do it because Russia can just be like, veto. Okay. Some other things that got started: Israel was formed for the Jews because of the Holocaust. And the World Health Organization was also started during this time. So you've heard a lot about that with COVID and things like that. So here's Israel right here. Okay. After World War II, a lot of the European countries went after Nazi war criminals and punished like the high-ranking ones, not sure like regular soldiers. 22 culprits that were high-ranking Nazi officials were put on trial and put to death for their role in the Holocaust. And we divided, why we did this, I'm not really sure, Germany into 4 different occupational zones. So Germany was divided between United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Problem with that is the Soviet Union, it was communist, and they wanted to do things their way. So they started the Berlin blockade, which means they were trying to starve the people of Berlin so that they would become communist. And so we, United States, responded with Berlin Airlift, also known as Operation Vittles, where we flew in and dropped supplies to the people of Berlin so they would not starve to death. And we did this for about a year. And he finally lifted the blockade because he realized that we were going to keep trying to help these people so they wouldn't fall to communism. Communism was the big issue of the Cold War. We were trying to prevent communism from spreading. We believed that we needed to contain it, keep it, in one area so it wouldn't spread, kind of like a virus. And we had what they call the domino theory, that if one country fell to communism, other countries would fall. The Truman Doctrine is the first thing we do after World War II to prevent communism from spreading. So Greece and Turkey were financially struggling. They were like, we need some help. Soviet Union's like, I got you, but I got you means you have to become communism. We were like, no, don't do that. So we wrote the Truman Doctrine and gave $400 million to Greece and Turkey so that they would not fall to communism. The Marshall Plan was a follow-up to that because we saw how well that worked. And we gave 16 countries money to prevent them from falling to communism. Okay. Some different things that were also started during this time. The National Security Act established the Department of Defense, because it used to be the War Department and now it was officially a cabinet position with the Secretary of Defense. We built the Pentagon. It actually started being built prior to our involvement in World War I. It actually started, they broke ground on it September 11th, 1941. And we established the CIA, which is our international watchdog. So, like, kind of like the FBI handles things in the United States, the CIA handles things outside the United States. NATO was started in 1949, and so these are all countries that are capitalist and free countries that came together to fight communism. And so the Soviet countries responded with the Warsaw Pact. So all of these red countries, these are Soviet or communist countries. All of the green countries, these are NATO countries or free countries. And the yellow ones are ones that did not join either. They remain neutral. Okay. After World War II, we learned our mistakes from World War I, and we stayed behind in Japan to help them rebuild their country after we dropped the atomic bombs during World War II. The China had a civil war over communism, and it was the nationalists versus the communists, and the communists won, and they were led by this guy right here, Mao Zedong, and all the nationalists fled China to Taiwan. So the people of Taiwan today are technically Chinese, which is why there's a lot of problems between China and Taiwan. The Soviet Union detonated their first atomic bomb in 1949, and then we followed it up with a hydrogen bomb 3 years later, which was way more powerful than the atomic bomb. We started HUAC, which is a government entity that looked for communists, because again, we're afraid of communism and we wanted to make sure that there were no communists in our country. And so the most famous thing where communism is concerned is called McCarthyism. And so this was a guy named Joseph McCarthy. He was a senator who was looking for communists everywhere. He was convinced there were communists in the government, in the military, and so he's most famous for going on these quote-unquote witch hunts for communists. The most famous couple to be tried were Ethel and Julius Rosenberg. They were found guilty and were put to death in the electric chair for selling secrets to the Soviet Union. Sorry. North Korea invades South Korea because North Korea is a communist country and they want South Korea to become communist. And South Korea was like, hey, can you guys help us out? So we actually go in with troops to South Korea to prevent South Korea from falling to communism. So that's what this little movement right here is. You see, starting in 1950 when it starts back over, how the red, they're going to push down in. So in 1950, this is how much North Korea had pushed down into South Korea. And with our help, we pushed them back up. And now the border between North and South is called the 38th parallel, or the DMZ, the demilitarized zone. And so you cannot just cross between North and South Korea easily. It's still a lot of animosity between these countries, even though this war happened almost 75 years ago. Some other things, you have, now we have computers, not the computers that we have today. These computers, they were giant, and the computing power in our cell phones today, like an iPhone, has more power than this giant computer did. You start seeing a group, the feminist movement gets really kind of amps back up in the 1960s. Sports are a big thing. Some most famous court case that happens in 1954 is Brown versus Board of Education, in which they overturned Plessy versus Ferguson that says separate but equal is okay. So this is when we start desegregating public education. Now, President Truman ended segregation in federal civil service when he became president because he didn't like it. And this is when we also start desegregating the military as well. Rosa Parks was most famous for sitting down on the bus in December of 1955. And we also have the Montgomery bus boycott that's going to follow this up, that happens for about a year in protest of what happened to Rosa Parks. But she was not the first person to do this. She just got more media attention. This girl right here was 15 years old, Claudette Colvin, and she was the first to actually try to do what Rosa Parks successfully did. The Little Rock Nine, so these were 9 students right here that were the desegregated Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, and they were met with violence and protest, and the National Guard had to be called in. The Civil Rights Act of 1957, the longest filibuster in American history, was done by Strom Thurmond, and he was what we call a Dixiecrat, a Southern Democrat, and he was fighting against the Civil Rights Act to prevent African Americans from getting any kind of help. You have the SCLC, which was led by Dr. King. It was a coalition trying to protest peacefully and get rights for African Americans. And they started things like sit-ins, which is what this is right here. This happened in Greensboro, North Carolina. So they would sit in restaurants. They knew they would not be served, but they would sit there in peaceful protest. And they were often attacked and spit on and stuff poured over their heads, all these things, which they practiced for. But they did this as a way of peacefully protesting against how they were being treated. And so this is the Little Rock Nine when they are going into Little Rock High School, and this is a sit-in. The space race is also part of the Cold War. Soviets were able to launch Sputnik 1 and Sputnik 2 before we got anything into space. We established NASA in 1958 and started putting a lot more money into math and science. Fidel Castro, this is Fidel Castro. Nikita Khrushchev took over the Soviet Union after Joseph Stalin died. And Fidel Castro, who's also a communist, he overthrew the leader in Cuba and promising socialism, and it quickly became communist. In 1960, this guy is Gary Powers. He was shot down over Russia. We were flying over them, spying on them, and they shot him down and realized that we were indeed spying on him. Alaska and Hawaii joined the Union as the 49th and 50th states in 1959. And that is the end of the 1950s.